How's everyone doing? My name is Nick Almiron. I am the Director of Support Engineering at Automox. I'm not actually here to sell you anything today. I'm here just to talk a bit about PowerShell. Show of hands, who's actually written a PowerShell script before? Awesome, love it. So what exactly does this mean? This is kind of a vague title. We're talking about security defense, what PowerShell can do for you there. There's a lot that goes into that, what I like to call cyber hygiene. With cyber hygiene, it's about diligence, about making sure that your environment is kept up to date, whether it's OS patching, software patching, management of third-party software, and then in the end, managing endpoint configurations. Today we're going to talk a bit about that last part, managing endpoint configurations. There's a lot goes into that, a lot of things you can do around that. If you're in a medium to small or medium to large organization, chances are you have Active Directory. You do a lot of this through GPO today. Things like disabling removable media, disabling guest accounts, setting on minimum password lengths, setting maximum password age, enforcing BitLocker encryption. At the end of the day, however, if you're part of a small business, chances are you may not have that luxury. The nice thing about PowerShell is you can do all of this through PowerShell. How you deploy it is up to you, whether you use another configuration management endpoint or configuration management software. A lot of different ways you can do it. I don't have a lot of slides today, actually. I want to just talk about code. So we're going to look at some code. If you guys have questions, raise your hands as we're going through it. No need to wait till the end. Happy to go through it. So let's go ahead and get started. So when it comes to those systems that I mentioned, a lot of configuration systems, whoops. Is it not? There we go. That's looking a little rough. Doesn't help. Yeah. Let's see if we can get that fixed real quick. Yeah. All right, well, it's still a little legible. We'll go through it while he's looking at it. Can you guys read all that, or is that a little small? A little small? There we go. I am surprised I remember how to do that. I don't remember the last time I've done that in ISE. All right, so when it comes to doing the evaluation, I like to put everything in functions personally. You see a lot of documentation in this stuff. What this helps you do, if you are sharing this code anywhere, you can essentially just do the general get help, and that gives you all this information that you've documented about the function. That makes this a lot easier to share amongst other administrators. You get more info, get actual examples here. You can even go as far as do detailed. You'll get some examples listed here towards the bottom as well. Somewhere here, should be. There we go. Most of that's just about documentation, being able to share the code. The nitty-gritty of this actual function is something called get BitLocker volume. What that does is give you information about those volumes and their current encryption state. If I could type. There we go. So you can see here we have some information about the volumes I have on my endpoint. Specifically, one of them's encrypted, one of them's not. That's a little harder to read in there. Still working on that, it seems. We're then going to use the result of this here, and we're going to filter out a bit depending on what we're looking for. Specifically here, there's a switch for all drives. Sometimes you only want to encrypt the operating system drive. Sometimes you want all the drives on that endpoint encrypted. What we're doing here is allowing you to define that as you use the function. When that all drives is actually selected, or the switch is passed, we're going to run this second one here, and that basically gets everything, whether or not it's an operating system drive. Otherwise, it'll just pull the operating system drives. We get information for that, check the protection status of that particular drive, basically see if it's off. You can see here on the bottom that protection status is on for one of mine and off for another. So if we were to go ahead and run this script, it's going to return true, saying that I'm compliant. Now let's say I change this up a bit and say I want all drives, and I go ahead and run that again. I'm going to get false this time because obviously I'm looking for all of my drives, and one of my drives aren't actually encrypted. Any questions about this before we move on to the remediation stage? What was that? She's going to bring a microphone real quick.
Are you running this against a list of computers, like a CSV file or something?
You can. It depends. If you have PowerShell remote managing enabled in your environment, you can do that. Outside of a domain, that gets really hard to do, right? So it really just depends what tool you're using in terms of endpoint configuration. There's a lot of options out there. Automox is one of them. There's my shameless plug. But ultimately, it's really up to you and what works best for your environment. Any other questions on this? All right, so let's move over to remediation. Remediation gets a little more complex. Same thing here, same documentation that I recommend putting on any PowerShell function. Makes it really easy to share amongst different administrators. If you scroll down here, you'll actually see the examples as well, whether or not you want to do all drives. And there's another option that we've added to this function, and that is basically to get the recovery key. The assumption we're making with this function is that you have a TPM chip on your device, and that's what we're going to use to encrypt basically, the BitLocker stuff. You don't want to do that, obviously, if there's no TPM, because then it's going to ask you for a password. The user won't ever have that password. If they go and try to log in, they're going to get to the BitLocker thing and not know what to do. When you do that encryption, there is an option to generate recovery keys. Those recovery keys can be used at any point in time if you ever need to get into that device, even if that TPM isn't there. When you provide that recovery key path, we're going to generate that as part of this function, right? So first thing we do is check whether or not that all drives option was passed. Depending on that, we're going to look again, either operating system or we're going to do all drives. Here we're adding another filter here, which is basically decrypted. We only want to return the drives that are actually not encrypted because that's all we care about. Once we get that information, for each drive that's returned, we're going to go ahead and enable the BitLocker encryption. That's what this function does right here. Pass it the encryption method, and then the recovery password protector is essentially generating that recovery key that we mentioned. That recovery key path, if it's not provided, it's going to skip this code altogether. If it is provided, we're going to get those recovery keys. And if you look at how get BitLocker volume stores all this stuff, you have the key protectors, right? So let's go ahead and run that real quick. You see this information here. There's two types. You see the TPM that I mentioned on the bottom there. Then that recovery password is that second part that we can use to bypass that if we need to at some point in the future. We don't need anything from the TPM one here. We just want the first object here, which is recovery password. That's why we pass this filter right here, where object equals recovery password. Once we get that information, we're basically accessing the data in that object, getting those, well, that wraps around a bit, getting the recovery key there and putting that in the file, storing it somewhere in your local drive so your users can reference it. At that point, you can send communication out, whichever way you best do those communications, email, whatever works for you guys. And that gives them the recovery key they can recover with if they need to. We're going to return true or false depending on the success of the function. That way you can determine whether or not you need to go look at this later. Error handling in general is done in the previous one as well. I forgot to talk about it in the evaluation, but that's what that try catch block is here. And that's essentially it. You deploy that through any configuration management system, and that'll enforce BitLocker encryption on all your devices. Now, this is just one example. The key thing that I want to point out is that you can do anything in PowerShell that you need to do. Some things you can't even do in GPO, you can get done in PowerShell. It's all up to you, your imagination, whatever you need to configure in your environments, you can do it. Any questions? Over there? She's going to bring you the microphone real quick.
Is there a function in PowerShell to check for the TPM module?
There is. I don't know it off the top of my head, but that's generally the nice thing about PowerShell. It's very well documented. That's one thing. If you just type into Google, it'll come up. I wish I knew that one off the top of my head, though, but I haven't had to do it. Most laptops these days are going to have a TPM chip, especially business laptops. Personal laptops, that's where it comes to being kind of more of a hit or miss. Any other questions? Awesome. So I'm going to be doing a session tomorrow on GIA in PowerShell. A lot more detail, cool things you can do with PowerShell and how you can limit administration. That's tomorrow at 2:30. Feel free to come by, check that out. I don't really have much else for you guys, but if you have questions, I'll be at the Automox booth in booth 16. Thanks for coming.